Hi, Scott. Thank you for joining me for this discussion. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today.
Well, thanks, Nikki. We've been corresponding by email, and I'm excited to have a chance to sit down and chat with you about some of these things because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there.
Yeah. So, for those that don't know, Scott is the coach of the 2025 male and female UTMB champions, which were Tom Evans and Ruth Croft. And of course, since then, his name has been in the media circuit or in the limelight, let's put it that way, with a lot was being written, a lot was being said, podcast recording. So, I'm one of those. I also wrote about it. What I want to do today is maybe go a bit in some of the details of your methods, your training, and less maybe what was done with the pros, and maybe more focus around some of the critique or criticism that was levied towards the approaches, and also kind of how we can apply that to more amateur or everyday athletes. So before we get started, maybe you can start with a small introduction about yourself, and more importantly, I'd like to know a bit about your background as an athlete and a coach, if possible.
Sure. Well, I currently, I'll work backwards from now. How about that? Um,
That's great.
I currently run a coaching business, an online coaching business called Evoke Endurance, and I have 18 other coaches. Um, I had originally started this coaching business with a different partner about, oh gosh, 10 or 11 years ago, called Uphill Athlete. And that was after I had written a book called Training for the Uphill Athlete. And I was my co-author with that was actually Kilian Jornet, excuse me. So most people probably are familiar with his name at least. And um, so that that book kind of launched this whole coaching business because I had been coaching before, but I was coaching cross country skiers, so Langlauf, and I was coaching mostly at the international level, the World Cup level. I did that for 15 years and coached some very high level World Cup athletes for that during that period. But I got my start in the beginning of those 15 years coaching juniors, and so I had a lot of experience with young kids. Prior to that, my background was a little mixed. I mean, I have an engineering and mathematics education, and I spent some time in that field and had a couple. I started and ran a couple of very successful businesses that I sold. Um, that allowed me to kind of pursue my passion, which was in sports. And I had been a lifelong athlete when I was very young, or not very young, but up until the college years and through my college years, I was a swimmer. And I competed at quite a high level in swimming. Um, then I just by accident fell into the sport of cross country skiing. And I had a rather short and not particularly successful career. I did race on the World Cup circuit for a little while, but not super successfully. But in the process of starting my kind of structured training and athletic career as I was probably 12 or 13, and then going through, I was being coached and I was on an Olympic development program for swimming, living at an Olympic training center. And I was exposed to some very high level coaches, and even as a teenager, was beginning to understand that there's something more to training than just going out and doing a bunch of hard work. And so I was exposed to the physiology and some of the methodologies of training for the sport of swimming. And then when I got involved in skiing, I realized, well, actually it's an endurance sport, and yeah, it looks different than swimming, but it's still an endurance sport. And I was also very active as a climber and a mountaineer during that time. And of course, mountaineering is another endurance sport. And I began to see how these sports were all connected. They share the same physiology. It doesn't matter if you're in a swimming pool or hiking, climbing a mountain, or running a race. It's they're the muscles don't know the difference when you're doing these things. And so I began when I got my first real job coaching was with this coaching these junior skiers. I realized actually I don't really I don't have any formal background in this because my education had been in engineering and math. So I kind of did a deep dive into physiology of endurance and started studying, a lot of the science behind it, but at the same time getting exposure to what coaches in other sports were doing. Because there's not very much written in English about training for cross country skiing. I was having to look elsewhere, other sports, and the most studied endurance sports are things like swimming, cycling, and running. So I did a lot of really studying of like what are the best coaches in those sports doing and why did they do it, and are there commonalities between what these coaches across all these sports do. And so I developed a bit of a body of knowledge kind of based on the science and the physiology, but then also the evidence based information I was getting from these coaches. And then I was sort of able to modify and adjust those ideas that I learned from these other sports into skiing. And it was through that process that where I really began to develop this idea that endurance is endurance. Obviously, if you're a 5,000 meter runner or you are a 100-mile runner, there's going to be some nuance in the way you train those, but they're both endurance sports. And they're underlaid, I should say, by the fundamental importance of the aerobic system for producing energy for these sports. And so taking that, I kind of ran with it and started to produce some, as I said, some very high level skiers. I sort of accidentally got involved in running because I had written a previous book called Training for the New Alpinism, which was obviously about alpinism. And Killian reached out to me and said, "Hey, I really like what you've done." I didn't know, I knew who Killian was, of course, but I didn't know him at all. But he emailed me and said, "I really like what you did, but there's a space for something like this for non-climbers, so the ski mountaineers, the runners, because they're gonna." He said that he understood because he has a background in exercise science how these ideas that I was talking about for client mountaineers, alpinists, how they would could be parlayed or adjusted to be used for the runners. But he said people are going to pick up that book and take one look at the cover with scary looking climbing pictures in it, and they're going to go, "Well, that's not for me." So I said, "Well, sure, I'll write that if you would help me with it and give me some of your ideas." Luckily for me, that was the winter that in one of the earliest skimo races of the season, Killian broke his leg. And so he was laid up for over 2 months, which for him is a long time to be sitting still. But it gave us the opportunity to collaborate at some depth on this. And through that process, we got to be friends. And the outcome was this book that was much more focused on the endurance aspects of running and ski mountaineering. So that kind of brings us around to where we are now.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Like, I think it's a real pro or like a real strength when people go through different sports and have the different backgrounds of like the swimming and the cross country skiing and the alpinism and the endurance running, more on the shorter and on the longer side. And yeah, I really think, like for example, myself, I'm mainly on the running side, and I always try to see what other people are doing. And yeah, but this is also a topic which actually it's coming later because I have some things to say about that. But
Okay,
um,
sure.
the thing which many people requested post UTMB, or which was essentially the headline, was essentially all around this muscular endurance concept.
Mhm.
And there's already a lot of information, and in that information you already said I've explained this 100 times already, so I write it down. um, but if maybe you can give, for people who haven't heard about it yet, maybe a small introduction about um, kind of what it is to orient a bit the discussion there.
Sure. And I think I need to backtrack probably, oh gosh, 25 years to talk about this because one of the very first books I talked about how I was looking for knowledge from other sources. One of the very first books I picked up was a book called The Theory and Methodology of Training by a Bulgarian sports scientist named Tudor Bompa, and it's an incredible book. It was written in the 80s, and he had a history of training all kinds of different sports, everything from like volleyball all the way through to running, and but it was very scholarly written, and that was where I was first introduced to this notion of muscular endurance, which is essentially the ability of a muscle to contract many, many times at a relatively high percentage of its maximum contractile force. So, we think of, I mean, obviously the muscle contraction is what's propelling us in our endurance sport, any sport, but certainly in these endurance sports. But in endurance sports, as compared to, let's say, more like speed and power sports or team sports games like football and basketball, those sorts of things, in these endurance sports, the muscles have to contract thousands of times, the same basic motion thousands of times over. So there's going to be a fatigue component in the that happens with those muscles. And Bompa categorized this muscular endurance as sort of a different type of strength training. So we might have, we can think of strength training, everything from, bodybuilding on one end of the spectrum to this, then going through things like, maximum strength, where, you're trying to, let's say more like a power lifter, trying to lift the heaviest weights possible, all the way to the kind of the other end of that spectrum is this muscular endurance component. And the training that he was describing for it, it's not very sophisticated, and I've come to realize it's not very sophisticated training. Actually, it's making the muscle contract many, many times. From dozens of times to hundreds to thousands of repetitions, even with relatively high load. And obviously, the fewer the repetitions, the higher the load needs to be and can be. So we could do a muscular endurance workout that might be 10 sets of 10 reps with 75% of your one rep max with 1 minute rest in between those sets. That would be a muscular endurance. It would also be probably a hypertrophy type training. In other words, that's going to increase the muscle mass. Or we could do, let's say one of the things we're no doubt get to is this weighted uphill, hiking or running with a pack on your back, and that pack might only be adding 10% of your body weight, but you might be doing several thousand repetitions of that in continuously with no rest. So there's a lot of different ways to train muscular endurance. And if you are, for many people, just hiking steeply uphill with no added weight will have a muscular endurance training effect. And so there's a lot of way, even high. Let me go back for just a second. One of the misconceptions, and I'm sure we'll dive more deeply into this, is that traditional high intensity interval training has a strong muscular endurance component to it. So let's say, a typical um, uphill interval workout that a trail runner might do. Maybe it's something like, 4 by 8 minutes up a steep hill running. Well, that obviously has a big cardiovascular load, but it has a very significant muscular load, kind of a local muscular load with it. And so that would have a muscular endurance training effect. So you can get this muscular endurance training effect in many different ways. So one common way for cyclists, and I've talked to a couple of tour riders, professional cyclists, and one of the ways they train it is seated in a big gear riding uphill. Putting in the big chain ring in the front and just grinding uphill for several minutes without stopping. Well, that is going to produce a muscular endurance effect, training effect. So there's a big spectrum of how this can be done, um, how
Right.
muscular endurance can be trained.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was a really good introduction for those who want to learn more. I know on your coaching website, the Evoke Endurance, there's the all you need to know about muscular endurance. So if people have like even more want more detail, it's there. And also, I think I found the book club I think a
Yes.
few years ago you went through basically every chapter in the training for the uphill athlete book. So there are a lot of additional kind of resources and ways for people to understand these concepts there. One thing that maybe I wanted to dive a bit deeper in is exactly this last part, the difference between the stimulus you'll get from a 4 by, what was it, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, or whatever,
Something,
and the
yeah, yeah,
muscular
yeah.
endurance workout. Like I've heard you many times talk about this concept of local fatigue and global fatigue.
Mhm.
Can you dive into that a bit more and maybe explain a bit more what constitutes local fatigue and what constitutes global fatigue and why you'd want one and not the other?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me start by telling you how I figured this out. I mean, I didn't
Right.
invent these terms, local and global, but I was when I was training my skiers, I we would we you know most endurance sports use high intensity interval training at some point in the training cycle. And what I noticed, especially with the kids, and these are 18-year-old, but they're quite accomplished skiers. They're very fit. They've been training for 10 years or almost probably by that time. And what I noticed is when we did an interval training session, let's say we were going to do, well, we wouldn't usually do that long of a repetition for kids, but maybe we were doing 5 by 4 minutes uphill. Um, that I would notice that the first couple went pretty well, but by the third or so, they can't reach the same high point that they reached before. And I would also notice when I looked at their heart rate that their heart rate would be lower on the final three. So they would just get slower and slower and slower each repetition. And they're not working at maximum intensity. So, because you can't work at maximum intensity for 5 minutes or 4 minutes even. So they're at submaximal intensity. So they're not really limited by the oxygen delivery system. The what we might call the VO2 max. They're not limited that way because they're below that intensity. So something else was causing them to slow down. And the fact that their heart rate slowed, as they slowed down, they're producing less power, so they need less oxygen. And since the heart is responding to the demand of the muscles for how much oxygen it needs through the brain, of course. The muscles are sending a signal to the brain saying, "Hey, we need more oxygen down here to do this work." But if through some fatigue mechanism, the athletes are slowing down, then the signal that gets sent to the brain is, well, we're not producing as much power, so we don't really need all that oxygen. So the heart rate will drop. And so this is, I think, a very interesting or an important thing for people to understand is if you're producing a high effort, but you see a low heart rate, that means you're tired. A lower heart rate than normal. So what I would see with these guys is that each interval gets slower and slower, and each interval had a lower and lower heart rate. So the fatigue was coming from somewhere else. The fatigue was peripheral. In other words, it's in the propelling muscles. And no doubt most people have experienced this, and that would be the concept of local fatigue. And no doubt most people have experienced it. If you run up a hill as hard as you can for very long, you will feel your legs give out. And that would be, you're also going to feel your breathing go skyrocketing through the roof, but you're going to feel this fatigue locally in the legs. And if you had enough willpower and you were able to continue running, you would eventually fall down because your legs would literally give out. And there's a complex physiological mechanism that takes place. Basically as the acidity in the muscles increases, the energy production through glycolysis basically grinds to a halt. And once that happens, you will be forced to stop. Doesn't matter how tough you are, you will be forced to stop. So I thought, well, how could we address this issue of local muscular fatigue? Because they're not getting the cardiovascular benefits of this interval workout if they just keep getting slower and slower and slower. And maybe they start out, and they're hitting 180 heart rate on the first repetition of this set of intervals. And by the last one, they're only hitting 150 heart rate. Well, the heart's not being taxed anymore by this because it's well below its maximum ability or pumping capacity. And so you're not getting the desired benefit at that point. So, what could we do? What if we were to make the muscles stronger, have more local muscular endurance and through some special workouts, and then we would then come back and do these intervals? What would we see? And what I noticed is when I put these kids through a muscular endurance training block, and in some cases it might have only been a few weeks, 4 weeks of this stuff, um, and then we came back to do those intervals again. Now they could keep a high heart rate through the entire workout because the legs were no longer the limiter. They were going to be limited by cardiovascularly.
Right.
And that
And
was
this,
kind of a light bulb moment for me when that happened. I thought, okay, this could be beneficial across pretty much all endurance sports. And in fact, there it's a mechanism. It's called by different names in some sports, but like in swimming, they sometimes swim with resistance devices attached to their body to produce, so they have to overcome a higher resistance in the water. Similarly, for some of the rowing and paddling type sports, they will put resistance devices, just like a blade hanging down below the boat to make you so you have to paddle harder through the water. Um, Kayakers have I guess something similar to a rowing machine they can attach their paddles to, and again add additional load that way. And so I thought, well, how could we do this for some of these more the sports that involve propulsion with your legs? And that's when I came up with, you know, I, during this time, I also ran across the writings of a Russian sports scientist named Yuri Verkhoshansky, and he covers this subject in great detail. He, in the Soviet Union, they were using, or he especially was using this training on the Soviet middle distance runners at their kind of international level middle distance runners. So I took his actual workouts and then modified them and reapplied them to skiing, and we saw tremendously good results with that. And so since then it's just I gravitated into more in running, and I figured out ways to do it for runners as well.
yeah, this is very pertinent because, for example, today I did a 4 by 4 minute session, and it's exactly as you described. Like I wasn't able to hit the upper end of my heart rate because there was too much fatigue in the legs. And yeah, I kind of felt like it wasn't a good quality workout. But as you said, then probably then for me the suggestion would be that I need to first do some muscular endurance workouts and then go back to doing those interval sessions, right? And if that's the
That's what
case, how would you prescribe that?
That's how I have built the programs that we essentially use for everybody. Again, this is applicable, from swimming to mountaineering to ultra to trail running. It doesn't really matter. If we can improve the athlete's muscular endurance, we can elevate the quality, as you just were pointing out, of the more traditional higher intensity interval workouts. And so I think it could be done in a number of ways. The most like the simplest one that I have come up with, well, the simplest, well, no, the longest one I have used in training, I should say. And I used this starting in 1992. This very similar workout that I'm going to describe to you now, because I was coaching a guy who was headed to his second Olympics in skiing, and this was at that time. This in the sport of cross country skiing, there are two techniques. There's the classic striding technique, and then there's a skating technique. Well, the skating technique was relatively new in the 1990s, and we were trying to figure out how to train for it. So we started looking around at how do speed skaters train? And we stumbled across a Soviet, well, former Soviet, Russian speed skating training program that was essentially muscular endurance. They didn't call it that. It didn't, it wasn't exactly what we're doing today, but I used it with this fellow, and I did it along with him because we kind of needed a partner to do it. Um, And I couldn't believe the effects of it. And so ever since then, so now this is what we're coming on, 30, 32 years that I have been using this methodology. And and from that, shortly after that is when I discovered this Soviet scientist I just mentioned, Yuri Verkhoshansky, and he had a program that could be done in a weight room, in a gym, with several different exercises. And I have an entire, as you point out, an entire article about this on the website, in which embedded in that article is this workout. So if somebody wants to get into the details, but I'll describe it in principle. Essentially, what it involves is a bunch of um, jumping, single leg exercises that are primarily, some of them are jumping type exercises, and you're doing sets of 10 repetitions, several sets of 10 repetitions. And in the beginning, I've used it for as long as 16 weeks, but over the course of the progression of this, whether it's 8 weeks, I tell people you should at least try to get 8 weeks of this in. But during the progression, the the rest between sets it starts at a minute, and it will work its way down to 10 seconds per set. And so the endurance in the beginning, it's mainly you're just trying to condition yourself to these exercises, because most people will finish this workout and say, "Well, that wasn't very hard," and then the next day they'll have a hard time walking down the stairs because it does leave you quite sore. So it kind of um, sneaks up on you, let's say. So the first several sessions are mainly going to be focused on building some strength. So the rests are relatively long. And then the rests start getting progressively shorter and shorter, so that by the end, when you're doing, let's say, 6 sets of 10 repetitions of these exercises, potentially with 10 to 20% of your body weight added, like with a weight vest, but only 10 seconds rest. Now you're beginning to get into an endurance workout, endurance exercise. So what starts as mainly conditioning and strength transitions over the course of many weeks into muscular endurance. And what I have seen with that is, like, in the first few workouts with it, if we check blood lactates during the middle of these sessions or sets, excuse me, that we'll see very high blood lactates. And then over the course of this period, even though the rest is getting shorter and shorter, blood lactates will decline, so that by the end, they can do that. They can do more work in a shorter time with more resistance with this added weight vest, more aerobically. And that's exactly what we want out of endurance athletes. We want, what the endurance sports or races, there are who can run the fastest for the longest with the least fatigue, meaning who can be the most aerobic the fastest. And what I've discovered with this is that makes the athlete, and I have a theory on how it works, but I've never read, I don't think there have been any studies, and I tend to discount them anyway because I don't think they deal with real athletes. But my theory is that you're taking you're normally in running, we're typically engaging the slower twitch, the least forceful fibers in the muscle. And what we're doing when we do these jumping exercises, and especially when we begin to add a little extra weight to them, is we're needing to engage the fast twitch fibers, the ones that are higher up on the scale of force production. And those fibers tend to not have very good endurance. But my theory on why this works is that by the end of this progression, maybe it's 12 to 16 weeks of doing this one time a week, is that by that time, these faster twitch fibers have begun to take on endurance characteristics that are more like the slow twitch fibers. In other words, you're developing the aerobic capacity in these faster twitch fibers. Now, these aren't your sprinting fibers. These are what are called the fast twitch A, which are kind of in the middle of the spectrum of from slow to fastest twitch. They can be modified. They can adapt to become more aerobically, have higher aerobic capacity. They develop more mitochondria. And my theory is that's what's happening in this thing. So that by the end, you've got a bigger pool of recruitable fibers that have higher endurance. And that's the reason I think that theory is true is that we're seeing lower lactates, which means that those those muscles are doing their work more aerobically. So they've got to have a higher aerobic capacity.
Right, right. Yeah. Um, I think, I mean, from what you say, to me, it sounds logical. And like also what the article I wrote was kind of trying to um, take a research lens to it. And of course, it also showed its plausibility. But of course, one of the reasons why we got in touch was also because of this article in the Ultra Running magazine, where essentially the whole, I would say, muscular endurance concept and the way to train for it was kind of a bit critiqued. And like the main points were essentially that it's like, or maybe that you get better bang for your buck for with more specific training. So spending more time on the trails, more time running, and rather than in the weight room. And if you want to spend time in the weight room, it's for a stimulus different to what you get on the trails. So less on
Mm-hmm.
the endurance side and more on the power side. What do you think they are missing, or why do you think there is such a difference in perspective?
Um, because they've never done it.
Okay.
they've I don't think they understand it, and I certainly don't. I mean, I have used this method with literally thousands of athletes. You know, at least I've used it with hundreds in person. And I have never seen results that were less than satisfactory. In some cases, the results have been fantastic, outstanding. Um, but this idea that I've put forth. I mean, I've sold 100,000 copies of each of those two books, and I constantly get feedback from people said, I would plateaued in my running, and I just, so I used this muscular endurance training program, and I just had the best race of my life. I mean, I've been getting those kinds of emails for 10 years. So if this didn't work, then I think I've never gotten a negative, like, oh, this sucks. It was terrible. I had a bad result. It didn't work. I've never seen that. So I would challenge I mean, I don't really care if they like it or not. It doesn't really bother me. But I suspect that they have actually never experimented with this kind of training. And uh, I did the same thing. This happened when I was coaching skiing. And I think I might have mentioned this to you in one of our email exchanges that when I was coaching skiing is when I kind of came up with some of these ideas. And I started using them and having more and more top results from my skiers, so that by the 2014 Olympics, half of the U.S. Olympic team were my skiers. I had, I had there were I was the only one. I had 5 skiers at the Olympics. Everybody else maybe produced. Every other coach had one maybe. And so people were asking me, well, what did you do? And I said, wow, it's easy. I'll tell you what I did. Here's how I did it. And they would, as soon as I told them, they go, oh, that'll never work. It's like, okay, well, sure, it doesn't work then. Fine. Um,
Right.
but what I think happens is in a system of a sport, there's a lot of tradition, there are conventional methods, and most coaches who have grown up in that sport. I'm really new to this whole ultra running thing. I've never done an ultra race in my life. Well, that's not true. I did one um, trail marathon many years ago. I guess that's not ultra, but it had a lot of vertical, so it was many out. It was 3 hours. It took me 3 hours to run that thing. But anyway, so I'm new to this, and I didn't come into it with some preconceived notions. It wasn't like I'm going to use the same methods I used on my that I learned when I was an athlete on this next generation of athletes. That's what I saw happening in cross country skiing. Is, well, we never trained like that before, so we use the methods that we learned about when we were athletes. And that most coaches are former athletes in the sport that they coach, and I think that's doubly true in the sport of ultra running. And so if you grew up with a traditional high volume, type of training program, which is very common, that's been the traditional approach in ultra running. And my athletes still train a pretty high volume. It's not like we're, this. I'll tell you a little story in a minute about that. But if you grew up and you reached your pinnacle of success, whatever that was, maybe you were a mid pack runner, maybe you were a champion, I don't know, then you're going to be familiar with that method. and you're going to feel comfortable with it because it's tried and tested and you know how to use it. It's going to be less likely that you want to experiment with something completely outside the box. So one of the athletes I coached years ago, one of the first ultra runner I ever worked with, um, he's a doctor, he's a surgeon, and he would spend he's a spine surgeon. So sometimes these surgeries would be 10 hours on his feet, on concrete in an operating room. And he had a family with 3 or 4 little kids. I don't remember. There was no way this guy could be running 120-mile weeks. His legs wouldn't take it. So we did a 16-week progression of this muscular endurance. And he did manage to get in a couple of 100 to 120-mile weeks in the buildup to the Tour de Géant, which, as you know, is a very, very long
Yep.
race, 300-kilometer race. Um, and but most his average for 6 months, I'm going to say this in well, I can say it in miles, but we can easily convert it. His average mileage for the 6 months leading into that race was like 48 miles. So what's that, like
Less than
70
80K.
kilometer? Yeah,
Yep.
70K. Um, like I said, he did have maybe 2 weeks in there where he punched over 100 miles, but most of them were low volume, and we relied primarily on the stimulus from this muscular endurance program. And he was on the podium at um, Tour de Géant, and he said the last 10 kilometers of that race, my legs felt the best they felt during the whole race. He said I still could, and his fastest part of the race was the last 10 kilometers. And so
Interesting.
that was an interesting eye opener for me. I mean, he was highly compromised because of his work and family situation. I wouldn't suggest that that would be the ideal program, but it did make me think, there's a stimulus that's coming from this that normally you would get it by very high volume training. The problem with very high volume training is, there's a lot of problems with that. You can get that muscular endurance training effect because you're going to be running in the mountains up and downhill all the time. It'll happen. But there is a big global fatigue cost to high volume training. And you run into everything from hormonal disruption, potential overtraining, injuries, time is especially for the amateur. It's one thing to coach a Tom Evans who all he does is eat, sleep, and train. And well, he does have a baby now, but it's essentially professional athlete. That's their job, is to train. But most people have some other things going on in their life that are going to severely limit the amount of time they can spend. Even if they have the capacity or the durability in their body to run 100-plus-mile weeks, that's a big time commitment for most folks. So it really made me stop to think, okay, this stimulus that we're getting from this little workout in the gym that takes less than an hour, we only do it once a week, had some kind of transfer over and carryover to the sport itself. I agree. It doesn't look anything like running. It's not very specific at all. But for some reason, it seems to really pay off. And again, I don't understand. Well, I think I understand probably the jealousy or the criticism of it. I think it comes from ignorance, lack of experience, and then perhaps some professional jealousy. I don't know, built into there too. I think all of those things could factor in. But I'll venture to guess, because I know something about the training systems that coach uses, that he's never probably experienced
Right.
this. Yeah.
The theory I choose to believe, I don't know if that's the right word, but is that I think, going back to the start of the discussion, you have a very wide or broad background, so to speak. A lot, especially a lot of it in the cross country skiing and the mountaineering side of it. While a lot of people currently in the sport, and me included, maybe look at, we always say running is not ultra running is not an extension of running, but still that is kind of where we gravitate towards. So maybe, where do you see ultra running on the scale of traditional running? You can take up to marathon distance, and maybe more on the mountaineering side, right? Like, is ultra running more on the mountaineering side? Should we be looking more at what they're doing there and less at the running side, or
Well, I train a number of professional, very high level, elite, world class alpinists, and they all run for training.
right?
That is their go-to. Yeah, obviously they go climbing a bunch, but their training primarily consists of running in the mountains. So I think the running component is improving their endurance through running, because running transfers, whether you're if you're running on mountainous terrain, you're going to get better at going uphill steeply faster, which is kind of what mountaineering is all about. Especially, we use a different style of muscular endurance training for them. Often it's with a very heavy pack weight. Maybe it can be up to 50% or more of their body weight. And they'll hike steeply up the fall line, because, again, that's what mountaineering looks like. It's very specific to their sport. Now, I've started in the past few years using something similar with mountain runners, and that is a lighter weight, somewhere in the range of 10 to 15% of their body weight, and having them run uphill. Um, and so, but to go back to your question, I don't think we need to decide whether mountain running is closer to marathoning or mountaineering. I think there's something that we can learn from the marathoners, and there's definitely something we can learn because of the high muscular loading in mountaineering that transfers over to mountain running. I mean, mountain running is a pretty complicated sport, much more complex to coach than, let's say, a road runner, because in road running, every stride is essentially the same. There's no variation in terrain to speak of. Whereas in the mountain running, we're having to deal with, first of all, you have to train to hike uphill, then that you're no longer running. But yet there's going to be, when we look at a race like the UTMB, with someone like Tom, he's walking almost half of that race, because of the steepness of some of the uphills. You just can't run. Or it'd be very inefficient to run that steep a hill, and very energy costly. So we need to train. We need to train uphills. We need to train downhills. We need to train flats. Um, and each one of those is almost like a different sport. So we're having to combine all these qualities. Where with road running, you have one quality essentially you're trying to address,
Yeah.
and that makes that a little bit easier. So I've tried to figure out is way how to incorporate the uphill, the downhill, the flat, into their training program, and we focus on all of those.
Okay. I'll ask another maybe speculative question. A few days ago, I was listening to a podcast with Jim Walmsley, and
Mm-hmm.
one thing which struck me is that he said that he feels that trail and ultra training lacks innovation. He did mention that the muscular endurance type training feels innovative to him, which again is ironic given that, as you mentioned, is coming from Soviet like literature or Soviet methods. But maybe again, the speculative question here is like, do you kind of agree that ultra trail lacks innovation? And if that's the case, like, why would it uh, be the case? You think when we compare it, for example, to cycling, where they're always on the forefront of trying something new, or I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, the Norwegian
Yeah,
method and road running.
yeah. I would, based on what I've seen, and I've only, maybe I have 10 years at this, um, of coaching, ultra running, and what I would call, and I don't really coach people that run flat ultras. All the people I work with are running in the mountains. Um, and but what I have seen is, yes, a lack of what I would call creativity, or thinking outside the box a little bit, of like, well, here's a problem, how do we solve it? And I think always through my coaching career, and I think it's honestly, it's not like I'm smarter than everybody else, but I think with an engineering background, you come into this with a problem solving attitude. It's like, okay, here's the problem. What are some methods we could use to solve this problem? Let's evaluate them. Let's try them. If they work, great. Maybe we can refine them. If they don't work, we discard them, and we move on to something else. And I think that if you, as I said earlier, if you grew up in this sport, I mean, I'm using that term, grow up in the sport, but if your career as an athlete and then segued into being a coach, you're very comfortable with these methods, and it can be a little frightening to take an athlete and try something new with them, because most coaches, I feel, that are, I think most coaches that are invested in their business or their job care about the athletes, and you don't want to try something that's going to make the athlete worse, injure them, or and so it's a little safer to just stay in the middle, do the things that, yes, they have worked, and obviously some of those coaches have produced tremendous results. So it's not like their methods don't work, but I think that's different than saying this method doesn't work,
Right.
which is what the arguments have been that have been directed against this concept of muscular endurance is, well, they just don't work. They're It's foolish, or we can get better effect from blah blah blah. And I think if you were to ask Tom and Ruth, I think would probably disagree with that.
Yeah.
So, but that's interesting. I didn't know that Jim had said that, but I think you're right. I think there is a kind of a complacency among coaches that this is the way we've always done it. It works. Let's don't rock the boat. Let's stay with these things that we know.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think again, I think there's also some of the road or typical running bias here, which yeah. Also having a few friends now who are more into the mountaineering and the alpinism side, I'm also kind of trying to see what I can learn from them. Um, but okay, pulling the conversation now to the amateur athletes, I saw a lot of like media, like questions and articles around what Ruth and Tom did. And of course, as you mentioned yourself, the amateur athlete has less time, is less genetically strong, or maybe has to work out his training alongside work, as you said. How would you maybe suggest that the endurance athlete, or sorry, the everyday athlete, approaches muscular endurance training? Do you recommend it for everyone? Do you recommend it only if people have more than, for example, 12 weeks of training? Like, how would you approach it for an everyday athlete?
Well, I know that it can benefit everyone, but there are a couple of caveats associated with that. One is that you need to have, well, you don't need to. We will benefit. You could do this with, a couch potato, and they will see gains. But if you have a high aerobic capacity, that will benefit. And you need to be able to maintain a relatively high volume of aerobic work during this muscular endurance, because it is high intensity training. And so you need to have aerobic, you need to maintain that aerobic base during this high intensity block of training. Um, so you need that helps. The other thing it does, it helps to have a fairly high general or basic strength level. Athletes that have a high strength level will tend to also be able to reach a higher muscular endurance level with it. And but that being said, I have had people come to me who were not particularly aerobically fit and weren't particularly strong. And we said, okay, your race is in 2 months. We're going to get in, 5 or 6 of these muscular endurance workouts because we know this will help you in the race. Um, and it's sort of like obviously you need to have some time to apply a stress like this because it is a significant stress on the body. It's not ideal to try to cram it into just a few weeks, but I've seen it work in even short durations. Actually, I had a guy in testing in my lab yesterday who's only been doing the muscular endurance work and a couple of hill sprint workouts for 3 weeks. And he told me that on one of his local, one of the runs that he does locally, that he's run hundreds of times, that he just set his a personal best on this. So about a 10 mile, so a 16-kilometer loop with about, I don't know, 500 meters or something like that. And he said, yeah, I set my personal best by 7 minutes, and my heart rate was 10 beats, average heart rate was 10 beats lower than I normally have on that. And he's only been doing 3 weeks of this stuff so far. And he's definitely what I would consider an amateur athlete, not at
Okay.
all professional at all. So it will benefit, I think, anyone who tries it. You in When you look at this workout progression that's in both in the book and on the website, you will need to approach it with caution because it's a very powerful stimulus and it will make you sore probably, and it will make you tired. So it's best to do especially the first few times you do this, do it early in the training build up to a race. If you've never done this before, it's a little dangerous to do it like with Tom and Ruth. We typically do this the jumping type muscular endurance I was mentioning before. Typically do that very early in the build. So right, in fact, like Ruth is just starting back to training now, after UTMB, and she's just starting that same muscular endurance that I did with the speed skater, or in the cross country skier, the Russian speed skating method back in 1992. Um, but then we'll shift more to more specific type muscular endurance work, you know, hill repetitions with weight, and some other things we do.
Right. And following that, would and then you go back, would you do your like 4 by 10 minutes, 4 by 8 minutes, and track progress then? Like, how do you track progress? Would you go back to the typical high intensity running work, or would you and then skip it entirely?
That's the standard recipe that I have told people. If I'm coaching someone, there's a lot more
For
possibilities of
sure.
what I can do. And especially if I've coached them, like with Tom and Ruth, I've coached them for years now, and I know their strengths, I know their weaknesses. They have a tremendously high work capacity. It's almost impossible to make them tired. So I have a lot of flexibility with them. But if I'm trying to talk to a general audience or write an article, I would say yes, do a minimum of 8, maybe if you can sneak in 12 weeks of this a block of muscular endurance, and then switch over to standard high intensity intervals, like that fellow who I told you about at the Tour de Géant. That's what we did. We did
Yep.
16-week block of muscular endurance. Um, then we shifted to more traditional uphill interval running. The first, and he has this steep hill near where he lives, that gains, I don't know, about 200 or 300 meters roughly, and the first workout back, he broke his previous record, even though he was carrying some fatigue from that 16-week build. And what happened I think we did 6 weeks of that, of intervals on that hill. Each week, he kept breaking his old record
Wow.
because he was getting recovered from the fatigue that he had carried into it from the muscular endurance. And what we noticed was so over those 6 weeks, he did it one time a week. His times dropped progressively each week, and then he went to the race. Um, so yes, that's a safe recipe. Block of muscular endurance followed by a block of traditional interval training. Yeah, and then
Right.
go into a normal taper after that.
Right. So for all the people listening to us now, that it's at least in the northern hemisphere, winter is coming. This is probably the time where you should start looking at your muscular endurance, and then
Sure. Yeah. And we'll probably, like with Tom, and depending on how long of a runway you have between, you know, the next big race. I mean, with Ruth, I'm sure we'll get in 2 cycles of
nice.
muscular endurance training before, her main race is later next year.
Okay. All right. I think that's a very strong like takeaway. I think the amateur athlete can take a lot out of that, and I think it was very clear on how to periodize your or the amateur or everyday athletes training. One thing that I also heard you talk about a lot, also in the media and in the articles, which I think not many people asked about, is the pole usage. The
Mm-hmm.
use of poles and pole efficiency and making sure that you use your poles to the best of your ability. Um, I originally come up from a very flat country where the longest hill is like 80 vertical meters, and I didn't use poles. Now I moved to a more mountainous area, and like I use poles a lot. The question is that I have is I still don't know if I'm an efficient pole user and how I can improve my pole usage, especially in the field. So can you maybe tell
Mhm.
us a bit more about pole usage?
Sure. That's one of the things that jumped out at me immediately when I started looking at these mountain races is I would see people carrying poles and the poles are hitting the ground, but they're not adding to the propulsion of the runner. And coming from cross country skiing, where poles provide a huge component of the propulsion forces for the skiers, I thought, well, these people don't even know what to do with their poles. And I think it's more common in Europe that people use poles. In the US, a lot of people don't even bother using poles. And that's because, well, I tried poles and it didn't work in that race. Well, it's because they never had trained with them. And they go out and use them. But so what I and Tom and Ruth were in this category of, yes, they carried their poles in their races, but they weren't really using them. So one way, and Tom said this like right after the finish line at UTMB, he said, "My triceps and upper back are going to be so sore tomorrow." That's how you can tell, are you using your poles effectively? Just like he said, it's going to be triceps and quads tomorrow that are destroyed. And so, and he's been training with to use poles now for some time. Um, but this year he got much better at it. So the way I have helped people try to learn to use poles is most gyms have a lat pull down machine. That's with a bar that you sit on a bench and pull the bar down either in front of or behind your head. And what I started doing with my skiers years ago is having them stand in front of that lat machine. So the bar is roughly at head or shoulder height, and grab it and pull the bar down with elbows bent maybe 90 degrees, and pull that bar down and touch your thighs or your right at your groin with it, and work on developing strength first, because most people aren't very strong in that kind of movement, and especially women. You can see big gains with that. Some, like, gyms will even have a rope. You can take the bar, the handle off, and put a rope through the cable and pull, and then your hands can actually go past your hips. And so you can develop a lot of very specific strength. And you could do a muscular endurance workout on that. So let's say you were doing your strength work with, maybe it's a couple of warm-up sets and then 4 sets of 4 repetitions with 90% of your 1 rep max. Now what I had to do with the skiers, because they're so strong, is we have to put a harness on them and anchor them to the wall, or they'll be pulled forward. But for runners, just stagger their feet, one in front of the other, and they can then brace themselves and they can pull hard enough. But you could also do like sets of 50 repetitions, and that would become a muscular endurance workout. So we do a strength block with that, and even later in the season we'll do maintenance of that strength, but we'll then shift to using a ski erg. You probably have seen, in many
Yeah.
gyms have the cross country ski ergs, and then that can be a very good muscular endurance training. And once you develop the strength and muscular endurance, then you'll all of a sudden go, oh, now I can tell I'm actually using my poles. But if you're not very strong, it's hard to have that muscular endurance, and then it's hard to really use your poles effectively. Um, but most of the people that I've worked with, I worked with a couple of high-level American runners who didn't really like using poles, and I put them on this program, and immediately they said, "Oh my God, my arms are tired and sore all the time." So it'll have a pretty pronounced effect, and you'll notice it right away. It's like almost anything that you're not very good at. As soon as you start training it, you see big gains.
Yeah. Yeah, I started cross country skiing a few years ago, and that was the first thing I noticed, that I'm really bad at using the poles. And more experienced friends would tell me, "You need to use your arms more." I'm like, "Yeah, but I'm a
Yeah.
runner." So,
Yes, yeah, but it will pay off. It will
yeah,
definitely pay off, and it's not hard to train for. I mean, these sessions. I keep the sessions on the skier very short because it's very boring. It makes a treadmill look exciting, um, And so we're usually on the ski erg for 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes maximum. So it's not like it's a big, takes up a big, time. It doesn't take a lot of time to train that stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think this was great. Very interesting, very fascinating. I hope that whoever's listening to us took a lot out of it, maybe some specifics and maybe some things that they can apply themselves to their training. As a last question, I want maybe a more speculative one, or a fun one, a fun question. We see ultra trail running like progressing very quickly, right? We see times are falling, course records are falling
Mhm.
year on year, and we see a lot of progress year on year. Where do you think we are on that development cycle? Like, are we reaching the top of that? Are we like plateauing in performances, or do you think there's still more to come?
I think there's more to come
Okay.
because, this, it's only been, and I coached a guy who was third at UTMB back in the late teens. I can't remember, maybe 17, 18, somewhere around then. And he could break 40 minutes for a 10K.
Wow.
Now, I would venture to guess that all the men on the podium this year could break 30 minutes for 10K. I know Tom certainly can. And so that's only happened in the last few years. So we're getting people with very strong running backgrounds. It used to be that these races were just like survival contests. You just got to make it through, and it wasn't really a contest of speed so much as durability. Not breaking down. But we get someone like Jim Walmsley who has an extensive background on the track, or Ruth with an extensive background on the track. For them to run, like I'll give you an example of, before Western States, Tom was doing most of his training at around a 3 minute kilometer. So very fast. He would go to the track and do 10 by 1 kilometer at 3 minutes, and with a 1 minute rest in between, and checking lactates each time. So that kind of speed, granted it's not world class running speed. He did go to the cross country world championships 2 years ago, and he was, I don't know, 50th place. Um, and so he's not competitive at that level. But if you bring something like, he's like a 28-minute or better 10K runner, you bring that sort of speed into the sport of ultra running. It's easy to build endurance off of speed. And I think that's what's happening now is you get people with maybe it's a collegiate running background, um, and even short distance. I don't know Jim Walmsley, but I understand he started off as a middle distance runner.
Yeah.
So 800, 1500, he's got tremendous speed. These running paces that he's doing in in these ultra runs, they must feel like walking to him. Somebody who can run a 150, 800. These such of speeds are kind of silly slow. And so it's a lot, like I said, it's a lot easier to take somebody who has good speed and build endurance. You can never go the other way. I mean, you never see any marathoners never move to the 1500.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen. But the 1500 runners often end up as marathoners, later in in their career. So I believe we are on the cusp of, going to continue to see big advancements. I've been sort of predicting, I think wrongly so, and Tom and I have had some not heated, but we've had some discussions about this. I've been sort of predicting when the purses in these races get big enough, the Africans will start coming, and we're starting to see some Africans in the shorter races. Um, I don't know that they'll have, they're built for real speed, and so they're rather light. You know, they look. I've never stood next to Eliud Kipchoge, but I can imagine that. He's got like bird bones. He's a very light guy. Now, could he handle 100-mile pounding like the UTMB? I don't know, but or could they, would they have the durability in their legs to run downhill fast for 1,000 meters and then turn around and run back up? I'm not sure, but they certainly know the running end of the sport really well. They might take them a while to transition. I don't know if that will happen. But I think, like I said, I think we're probably going to continue to see. I mean, we just an example would be, oh my gosh, blanking on his name. He did well at UTMB, or at the CCC, I believe. An American. He won the JFK. He has the fastest time, the JFK
Mm.
50 mile in the U.S. He ran it's 50 miles and he ran it in 5 hours,
Yeah,
and it's got a couple thousand vertical feet. It's not.
yeah,
The last 2/3 is flat, but it has some climbing in the beginning. But his average speed was, what's that? 6-minute
yeah.
miles.
6 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, for 50 miles.
Oh, yeah.
And so yeah, that kind of speed. David Norris was his name.
Okay.
Yeah, or yeah,
Yeah,
I
as you
think
were
that's it.
speaking, I was also thinking of, I don't know, like it's also a discussion you hear that if these like 204, 205 marathoners, East Africans decide to go to ultras, it would be an interesting it would be very interesting to see the results. And I think personally there is a difference between like a javelina, which is kind of flat for ultra
Yeah.
standards, there's and then
Hmm.
Western States, which is somewhere in the middle, and then I think there's UTMB or even steeper. And I think there's also difference there in what we'll see in terms of results.
Yeah, I think you'll see different type of athletes. I mean, just like
Yeah,
now when we look at the more traditional running, you know, 800-meter or like 400-meter runners look nothing like 10,000-meter runners.
yeah,
We're going to see people with certain body types, gravitating towards, we're not going to see, men that weigh 200 pounds winning 100-mile races probably. But I think that people who have, you know, are powerfully built, they could potentially do better in the shorter races, and then the people who are lighter, more look more like runners, will be do better in the longer races. But I think we're in a very interesting period. It's because the sport is changing really fast. As you said, every race we're seeing records being broken, and times dropping, and the field getting closer and closer in many cases. So I think that's that's a fascinating thing. I think the sport of ultra running is kind of where triathlon was, 10 or 15 years ago.
wow.
Where now we're seeing triathlon races where, at an Ironman races are finishing, within seconds of one another.
Yeah. Oh, 10 or 15 years behind Ironman. That's more than I expected, but I mean,
Well,
it's
I could
plausible.
be. I mean, it could be less than that. I don't know, but
Yeah.
but I think we're. I think it's just when we look at the kind of fields that we're seeing, now. Yeah, yeah, I mean, watching like someone who had like Walmsley or Tom, who have such good running speed, when they get to sections of the trail where they can actually run, it's quite amazing to watch how
Yeah.
fast they're moving, for considering, well, he's 12 hours into a 100-mile race, and he's clipping along at very fast pace, which, from my limited knowledge, when I look back at the sport and the people I have worked with 10 years ago, it's different. It's quite different now.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Fascinating discussion. Thanks a lot for your input. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And yeah, that's it from my end. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Nikki. It was good talking to you. I enjoyed it. You had some great questions.
Thank you.